bring greetings to you, to Dr. Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, and to all of the members of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, and also bringing greetings to other distinguished panelists and guests who are in attendance. Thank you for this opportunity to share a few thoughts about my family heritage and legacy as it relates to the Black church experience. Growing up as the grandson of Reverend Carlisle Fielding Stewart Sr., who was a spiritual leader and pastor of Ebenezer AME Church in Detroit for many years before he became the founding pastor of People's Community Church. His father, the Reverend Henry Elijah Stewart, also a distinguished AME pastor, ordained by the Bishop Henry McNeil Turner in 1888. His son, as we mentioned, Reverend Carlisle Sr., followed in his footsteps in the AME Church, and also uncle/cousin, really call him uncle because of his age group, was also an AME pastor out of Chicago. So he had three generations of AME ministers: Reverend H.E. Henry Elijah Stewart, Reverend Carlisle Fielding Stewart Sr., Reverend Darnell Vincent Stewart, who succeeded my grandfather as lead pastor of People's Community Church. I represent the fourth generation of Stewart men who have gone into ministry, and my son, Reverend Carlisle Fielding Stewart IV, a recent graduate of Harvard Divinity School, is also serving on staff with me at the Empowerment Church. The Black church has been a mainstay for my journey and my experience along the way. It has certainly been a place that has been called family. And so much I have learned in that experience as we have journeyed together, not only collectively as a people in America, but also as individuals who have found our way and our identity in this American experience. So I'm grateful to have this time today to talk about the church, which has become the bedrock and the seedbed of our experience as African Americans in this society. And I am grateful to be a part of that legacy and heritage with so many people that I've come across and have done fellowship and had community with over the years in so many positive ways. When I think about the Black church as a family, as an extended family, I am reminded of the church primarily as a place of hospitality in a world of hostility. The church as a place of learning and development in a world that did not always value the presence and the contributions of African Americans, and also a place of empowerment. I'm so grateful to have had an opportunity to have had this journey along the way, to meet so many people and to experience the Black church in ways that have not only been informative, but also transformative for the people who have been part of the fellowships of which I have served and been a part as we journey along this way. I thank you for this opportunity to give some thoughts and insights on the meaning of the Black church as extended family in the United States of America. Thank you, and God bless you.
Hi, I'm Howard John Wesley, the senior pastor of the Alfred Street Baptist Church in Alexandria, Virginia. And the road that led me here in ministry could only have been navigated by God. I am the son of a Baptist pastor. And as I came of age, I realized that not only was my dad a pastor, my grandfather was a pastor, and my great-grandfather. So you can imagine growing up in a household like that, it was always prophesied that I was going to be a preacher and a pastor. That's the last thing I wanted to do. One, because I saw how difficult pastoring was through my dad. Two, I didn't think that pastoring would lead me to any kind of life of material gain and possession that I wanted. And three, it just didn't seem like something fun. You had to be too holy to be a preacher. Well, if you ever want to make God laugh, tell God what you're not going to do. I told the Lord I didn't want to preach, and yet I felt a call of the Lord to be a preacher back in 1989 when I was 17 years old. I accepted the call with the condition I made an arrangement with God. Okay, God, I'll be a preacher, but you know what? I'm not going to take it seriously. Maybe I'll be an associate minister down the road, But at 17, I was on my way to college. If I can be honest with you, I was going to have a little fun. There was some sin I had to get out of my life, and I wanted to make money. So I went to Duke University to have some fun, to get a little sin out of my life, and to make some money. I majored in biomedical and electrical engineering, and actually was accepted into medical school. And it was in my first year of medical school that I began to feel some frustration, like this wasn't where the Lord wanted me to be. Have you ever been in a place where you were good at something, but you just didn't feel that it was the right fit? And in the midst of that struggle, the Lord brought me into conversation with Samuel Proctor. And Samuel Proctor, listening to my story and praying with me, shared with me that I needed to leave medical school and go to seminary and be faithful to the call of God. So I'm here to tell you that I am a proud medical school dropout. I dropped out of medical school and applied to seminary and made another deal with the Lord. I said, okay, God, I'm going to apply to seminary. And if it's your will, I got to get in, but I'm only going to apply to some of the best. I applied to Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and Boston University. And God made a way in all of them. Eventually, I chose Boston University, was given the honor of being a Martin Luther King Jr. Scholar. It was there that I developed a passion for religious history as I took a course with Dr. Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham at Harvard. And from there, the Lord called me to pastor a beautiful congregation in Springfield, Massachusetts, St. John's Congregational Church. We started off with about 200 members, and in 10 years, we grew to 3,000. It was a blessed experience of learning that pastoring is not about exerting authority. It's about showing and sharing love. From there, the Lord then opened the door and called me here to Alfred Street Baptist Church in Alexandria, Virginia, where I've had the joy of growing and serving with this congregation for 13 years. The most phenomenal Christians I've ever been in relationship with. We're not perfect, but we seek to serve a perfect God and to bear witness of that love as we serve God's people, as we open our arms to the reality that all of God's children are made in God's image. I am grateful for where the Lord has brought me, even though I never would have seen myself here. God, thank you for the journey that led me here.
Hello, family. My name is LeahDaughtry, and I am honored to serve as the presiding prelate of the House of the Lord Churches. With my ordination in 2001, I joined my sister Daughtry in the 5th consecutive generation of clergy persons in the Daughtry family. Our family heritage and ministry began in the days of enslavement and continue now with my nephew Lorenzo, who is the 6th consecutive generation. Many are surprised to know that my sister Dawn and I are not the first women to be ordained. We are preceded by my great aunt Nellie, who was a traveling evangelist in the early 1900s. Now, on my father's side, the Daughtries, we exited enslavement and became part of the Methodist Church. Not the AME Church, just the Methodist Church. In fact, my great-grandfather, William Van, was a presiding elder in the Methodist Church of America and pastored the Asbury Methodist Church in Savannah. His son, my grandfather, Alonzo, left the family tradition of Methodism to become Pentecostal when he met Bishop Marcelino Manuel de Graça, who became known as Sweet Daddy Grace, the founder of the House of Prayer for All People. My grandfather was ordained to the ministry by Bishop Grace himself, who then sent him to pastor the House of Prayer in Augusta, Georgia. Major doctrinal differences led my grandfather to leave the House of Prayer in 1929 with many others and to found our church, the House of the Lord and Church on the Mount Incorporated, a holistic ministry that serves the God of the oppressed and Jesus Christ, African in origin, revolutionary and redeeming in action. On my mother's side of the family, the Smiths, my great-grandmother was an early devotee of Father Divine. Joy Love, as she was named by Father Divine, spent much of her life living, working, and serving directly with Father and Mother Divine in the Peace Mission headquarters in Harlem. Ministry runs in our family and across faith traditions. We are Christian, Muslim, and Buddhist. We are imams, ministers, and pastors. Our family gatherings are an interfaith affair. Being a fifth generation pastor means I'm a fourth generation pastor's kid. I was born into church. I was born into service. I was born into ministry. For us, ministry is for everyone, no ordination required. All that is needed is a willingness to serve God in the way that God asks. So I have served in nearly every possible way in church: usher, choir director, trustee, Sunday school teacher, preacher, rally organizer, sign maker, petition carrier, issue advocate, community activist, pastor, elder, and now bishop. But neither is ministry limited to the four walls of the church. My career in the political arena is ministry in a different form. As I work to bring about the kind of change necessary to build a society that reflects God's justice, grace, mercy, and love. Why did I go into the ordained ministry? It's really quite simple. Because I heard the voice of God, because God called me, because God asked. And as the saying goes, my arm's too short to box with God. So I said yes. And I do my best every day to live up to our family motto: love God, love the people, serve God, serve the people, and our lives will be blessed.
I want to say thank you to all of the organizers, the phenomenal, incredible historians, and to my sister and professor, Dr. Evelyn Higginbotham. I want to say thank you for this opportunity to be a part of this conversation and just share a little bit about my journey in ministry and my family in particular. It's interesting. I come from a lineage, my father being a minister, my grandfather being a sharecropper, but I developed in the Black church, in the prophetic, social justice, activist Black church as a child. Both of my parents involved in the civil rights movement. As a matter of fact, they met in the movement. My mother was one of the office managers for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and my father was a lieutenant in the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and they met in the movement introduced by a mutual friend by the name of Jean Young, who was the wife of Andrew Young. And as a result of that union, I became a part of the family. And I grew up in a church that was deeply committed to the transformation of the African American community and ultimately the world. But I didn't want to be involved in pastoring. Great respect for it, but did not want to pastor. My interest was cinematography and film, documentary film, and also sports. And it was at Morehouse College, being connected with the chapel at Morehouse College, Dean Lawrence Carter, who is the inaugural dean of the chapel, and witnessing a variety of absolutely brilliant men at Morehouse, and seeing how they were studying and developing and getting involved in what were called ciphers at the time, of talking about what they had been reading. People literally going at each other between, I read Frantz Fanon and looking at Julius Nyerere and looking at the Negritude movement, and you would witness these young men, Black men, who were talking about everything from Kant, Hegel, to Du Bois, to Audre Lorde and Octavia Butler. It was a powerful experience to be in a space that affirmed one's intellect and affirmed one's spirit. And it was in that space where I accepted my call to ministry, but was very clear that I was not going to pastor. I was trying to get to NYU to learn about documentary film and possibly go to Union Theological Seminary to study under James Cone. But as God would have it through sacred serendipity, I applied to those programs, Union in particular, to work with James Cone, but did not get any money until later that summer. But a school by the name of Yale and Harvard said, hey, you can come here. I had those, they were not on the radar, but the experience at Yale and working with a wonderful group called Elm City Nation, which was a gang violence prevention group. And they became, in many ways, my seminary professors. I had wonderful professors at Yale Divinity, but they helped me understand the need of people involved in ministry who could make connections between the street and the sanctuary, between the academy and Main Street. They were incredibly supportive, and they encouraged me that we need people who are doing the work academically, but also who are in the pulpit and committed to transformation. So I've always lifted up the young brothers that I worked with at Elm City as being transformational in my growth and development as a minister, and eventually moving into the path of youth ministry that eventually would lead me in the path of pastoring, because I had the privilege of working with young men, many of them who had not finished high school, who some had been doing dirt in the street, but they believed that there was a transformative spirit that could change our community. And so that's a little bit about my story. And I'm privileged to be a part of this conversation. And I thank you so very much. And I look forward to being able to connect in person with everyone who is a part of this incredible gathering.
Association for the Study of African American Life and History. And I am thrilled to moderate this panel of clergy, because when one thinks of the Black family, a solace theme for 2021, when one thinks of how the very word family is used in the Black community, it most often takes one of two forms: the nuclear or extended family of parents and children, of aunts and uncles and cousins. But when we say family, we also use that word to talk about the church family, the household of faith. For example, we say church mothers, church fathers. In fact, before the 1960s, before we were saying Brother Malcolm and Sister Angela, it was in the church where the words brother and sister were constantly heard. And so you have heard from 4 ministers who shared with you their family heritage of church leaders and who gave you their personal story of their journey into the ministry. You heard from the Reverend Dr. Carlisle Fielding Stewart III of the Empowerment Church. You heard from Reverend Dr. Howard John Wesley, senior pastor of the Alfred Street Baptist Church, Bishop LeahDaughtry of the House of the Lord Churches and National, and Reverend Dr. Otis Moss III of the Trinity United Church of Christ. Afterward, which is really right now, because they've given you their faith story, we're also going to hear now about the larger story of family. And that is their story of their church families. And I want to thank you, each of you, for sharing your fascinating story. But as we turn to live format and as we communicate in person, I would like for you to talk about the role of your household of faith and yourself in serving not only your members, but also the larger Black community. Unfortunately, Reverend Dr. Carlisle Fielding Stewart III had an emergency that prevented him from joining us in person. But he has nonetheless kindly answered the question that I posed to him. And that question is this: Reverend Dr. Carlisle Fielding Stewart III, what do you say to someone who asserts the Black church is no longer relevant today? I know you don't believe this. So what to you are the hallmark features of the Black church that continue to this day? Reverend Stewart.
Thinking of the Black church, Black faith leaders, a legacy of service, the Black church itself. So many words that can be spoken about the life and vitality, the purpose and power of the Black church. This sitting will not suffice to share that information, but the three basic things that I think about right off, and that is the Black church has been an extended family, a community of faith, and a community of empowerment that have enabled Black folks primarily to formulate their identity, to grow in their purpose and power in their experience in America. I think first of the Black church as a place of hospitality, a place of belonging, a place where African Americans have been welcomed over the years to feel that they've been part of something vital, that the part of the Black church that is so vital, in which it has transformed the hostilities of the larger culture into hospitality and belonging for Black people. The second hallmark that I remember and that I affirm as part of my experience is that it is a place of learning and development, learning how to do business, learning how to share, learning how to fellowship, learning how to build institutions. The Black church is one of the first institutions that we built as a community of faith. And in that, we've learned ways of seeing the world and ways of interacting in the world. Through the messaging of the preacher and the fellowship of believers, we have learned the meaning of who we are as we are seen first and foremost in God's eyes. We have developed alternative understandings, other optics and apertures by which we have looked at ourselves and valued ourselves as a people in this country, despite all of the other narratives that have not been to our true purpose. So it's important to understand the meaning of learning and development, developing our minds and our spirits, developing our resources and our potential, an integral part of the ministry of the Black church. The third piece of this is a place of forgiveness and redemption, a place where people had your best interests at heart. It was a wonderful experience growing up in my grandfather's church as a child and growing in young adulthood and all of the things that meant for me in terms of building self-esteem, a sense of somebodyness, a sense of value. And one of the things that stands out really very, very prominently for me is in conflict resolution situations, there was always an approach that smacked more of confrontation rather than confrontation. And so I am indebted to the people of faith and those early communities who helped to shape my consciousness and my understanding of the world, who helped me to build self-esteem, as well as the other young people who attended the church, and helped to lay the groundwork and the foundations for empowerment and for a sense of citizenship contribution to the United States of America. When I think about our experience, it has always been one of adding value and being people of strength, resiliency, and empathy, and compassion, and spirit, which have imbued us with so many gifts and graces that have allowed us to survive and to be an integral part of building America economically, communitarily, and in other ways which are second to none. Thank you for this time. God bless you all.
Bishop Leah Daughtry, For someone like myself, who has written a book on women's gender consciousness and activism in the Black church at the turn of the 20th century, I must say, you make me proud. Not only because you are a woman in a uniquely powerful and what is most often a male leadership position, but also because your leadership has taken you to the intersection of faith and politics. You are a living testimony to the belief that a faith inclusive of all people should be the kind of faith that informs our politics. Faith isn't really just the purview of the religious right. So talk to us about what this means to you, Reverend Daughtry.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Hickenbotham. And it is such a joy and a pleasure to be with you and my colleagues, and to still be in relationship with you after all these years. For those who are watching, Dr. Hickenbotham was one of my first professors when I was a freshman at Dartmouth College. And these many years later, to still be in conversation and to see the places and the lives that she influences is just a joy to me. I still can't call her Evelyn, though. She will always be Dr. Higginbotham to me. As we consider the question that she's posed to me about the intersection of faith and politics, this is the path that I chose, or the path where the Lord has led me, as I have the opportunity, the grace to be in rooms where political and policy decisions are made. I claim this lineage that you heard in the video, and I think that is what has uniquely prepared me for this time in this space that God has given me the grace to enter, whether it's my grandfather that navigating the variegations of being a Black churchman inside of a white institution, or my grandfather who sued burial societies and pursued economic empowerment for his people in Augusta, Georgia, or my father, the Reverend Dr. Herbert Daughtry, who is certainly at the preeminent place when it comes to activism and the church, having chaired the National Black United Front, the African People's Christian organizations, and having been on the front lines of any movement that seeks self-determination for all people, particularly African people, whether that is domestic or international, in Grenada, in South Africa, in Ireland. And so I come to this work with a very clear understanding that my role in this space, and for all of us who walk in this space, is threefold. One, as pastor, providing healing, counseling, and direction; as priest, interceding with God through ritual, ceremony, prayer, and fasting; and as prophet, critiquing society from a biblical perspective, which places God on the side of the impoverished, of the oppressed, of the discriminated, of the disenfranchised. Walking into these rooms then to participate in conversation is really to try to embody the ethos of pastor, priest, and prophet, but also to embody the best of the Black church, which our colleague has just so eloquently described. The question that we have to all ask is, what is the church, and who is the church? And particularly, who is the church in the world? Are we simply an institution that seeks to save souls and help people to get to heaven by and by, with pie in the sky, all of that? Or are we an institution, as I believe, as I teach and preach, and as I try to live, that says that this society and my work in this society is to try to ensure that God's grace, God's justice, God's mercy, and God's love is the touchstone for all of us and for our work. The church then has to be an embodiment, a reflection of our understanding of who God is. If we think that God is only concerned about our souls, then that leads us to one kind of church. If we believe that God is concerned about the totality of our being. And God is concerned that we live the full and abundant life that God has promised, that God is concerned about, that we have clean air and clean water and safe streets and good food. Then we work to see God's church and God's goals and God's priorities made manifest in the world. Now, we can pray about it, we can talk about it, we can preach about it, or we can be about it. We can be in the streets if that's what's necessary. We can be in the halls of Congress or at the state capitol if that's what is required. The fundamental question is that tried and true question: what would Jesus do? But even beyond that, what would Jesus say? And where would Jesus be? And the answer for me is Jesus would be under the bridge in Del Rio with the refugees who are seeking a better life. Jesus would be with those in Louisiana and New York who've lost their belongings due to climate change, due to our lack of stewardship over this earth. Where would Jesus be? Jesus would be where people are hungry, where people are hurting, where people are weary, where people are mourning. That's where Jesus would be, not simply to comfort them, but Jesus would also be in the halls of Congress, in the halls of the state capitol, to fight for policy that ensures that people have what they need, that people can live fully and abundantly into fullness that God created them to have. So what does that mean? We work. We work in the church. Yes, we pray. And God knows, when I was growing up, we'd have a rally, a boycott line. And when we got finished boycotting and rallying, we come back to the church for the prayer meeting because we knew where our strength was coming from. It is our responsibility then as Black church men and women to be the Spirit of God in the earth, to reflect the Spirit of God, and to demand and work for the justice of God, the mercy of God, the love of God to be made manifest in every area of our society until the Lord comes again. And that means not just how we act outside of the walls, but also in the four walls. Are we welcoming everyone? Are we loving everyone? Are we valuing everyone in a way that God values all of us? There is room for the women, yes. There is room for the homosexuals, yes. There is room for the Black, the brown, the white, the yellow. There is room for everyone because God loves everyone. We do not get to discard what God has included. We do not get to shut out the people that God has brought in. That is our calling as the people of God, as Black church men and women, as the reflection of God and God's grace in this time and in this nation and in this world, to be who God would be, to do what God would do, and to be where God would be.
And you can see why I am proud of Bishop LeahDaughtry. Reverend Dr. Howard John Wesley. Now, I've also known you since you were a student. I loved your candor in your recorded statement, your honesty about the way you were thinking during your college years. However, by the time you got to my class, you were a graduate student. You weren't an undergrad. So I can attest to your having become very serious, very well-read, and in fact, erudite. And those admirable qualities are reflected in your sermons. So I'm wondering what you understand to be not only the spiritual role, but the intellectual role and the active, tangible role of the church in times of deep social division, emotional trauma, and social disparities as we see in America today. What are for you and your church family the true expressions of love to old and young alike? Reverend Wesley.
First of all, thank you. First of all, I'm still shouting from Bishop Daughtry, so give me just a minute to gather myself together, because that sister just lit me on fire. Bishop, you make me want to go back and revisit my calling and make certain that I'm doing the right thing here. Thank you. And to all my other panelists as well, especially my brother, Otis. We go way back. We're friends, and I'm grateful to share this platform, and thankful for you, Dr. Higginbotham, for the invitation. It allows us to come together. All of us can look back at our lives and see your fingerprint upon our ministry and our lives, and our understanding of our calling. And so it's indeed a high honor to be back in this place with you. I still feel like a student back in 1995, sitting in your class at Harvard University about the African-American religious experience. And that set me on a path of understanding the necessity of reading, the necessity of study, of scholarship, to bring to the Black pulpit more than just the cathartic praise and the shout and the celebration that was quickly becoming a distorted variation of what Black preaching was, especially as we saw what began to happen when Black preaching was touched by the prosperity movement of the late 80s and early 90s, and how that began to shift and change what we were doing in the pulpit, not only in losing that intellectual acumen, but embracing what I think was a half doctrine. Yes, the Lord wants us to live well, and yes, the Lord desires us to have productive and happy lives, but material wealth was never at the crux of the ministry of Jesus Christ. And I think we needed to abandon that as we move forward. And then we saw some things begin to happen in the world that I think really called the church back, especially the Black church, back to its prophetic voice within community. And that is this resurgence of ism, the resurgence of supremacy, the resurgence of, as Bishop just mentioned, excluding people whom God had created in God's own image. And I think the sad thing for me was recognizing how the Black church was becoming complicit in those walls. We were those who suffered against the isms of race and privilege, and then became the very ones who lifted up the walls against sexual identity and excluding people. It's almost like the oppressed then found some more to oppress. I mean, I think the Black church at its core has always had a prophetic, cathartic, and even kind of like ER feel, a place of hope and healing where people who've been damaged and wounded by the weekly vicissitudes of life, by the inequities and inequalities of American society, by the disproportionate stereotypes that limit us, we found something in the Black church, not only identity, but we also found a challenge to our mind that then challenged how we walked in the world. And so for me, coming to the pulpit weekly really is a stewardship moment of asking the Lord, what do you require of me in this preaching moment to share on your behalf to these people, to equip and empower them to model the life of Jesus Christ in the world in which we live. And for me, that requires a few things. One is relevance, that I don't believe there's any subject matter that ought to be void and vacated within the body of Christ, because the reality is that our members deal with it Monday through Saturday. So we might as well address it on Sunday, lest we fall victim to what I think has caused many a generation to walk away from the church. And that's the irrelevance, that we don't come to church just to shout. I don't come to church just to say amen. All that is well and good. But at the end of the day, if I'm not equipping our members and our community to face the reality of Monday, then church has been a waste of time on Sunday. So there's got to be that relevance. I believe secondarily, there's got to be this transparency within the pulpit. I think I was raised in a generation of watching preachers, especially Black Baptist preachers, who believed that the way to connect was through a model of perfection as opposed to a model of redemption. And by that, I mean, I don't believe that my call is to stand in front of congregation to pretend as if I've never sinned, to pretend as if I've not struggled with mental health issues, to pretend that I've never been depressed, to pretend that I've not had to be delivered from an addiction to pornography in my early life. And I think sharing that transparency requires a vulnerability that many a preacher have abandoned, but is absolutely necessary for the conveyance of the gospel. That what people want to hear are the stories of those that have been redeemed, that have struggled, that have found the grace and the love of God in the valleys of life, and not those who simply walked on mountaintops. So I believe in the relevance. I believe in the transparency. I believe in the social justice aspect of the gospel. And Bishop just kind of spoke to this, that God cares about our entire lives, and we cannot detach the gospel from the political atmosphere and world in which we live. Now, that being said, Dr. Higginbotham, one of the challenges is to realize that in any given congregation, you will have people on different sides of any issue. I've got GOP and I've got Democrat within our church. I've got those who are very conservative minded and those who are very liberal within our church family. And so one of the things I take as a challenge is to share with our church family that my job is not to make you think what I think. My job is to make you think that ultimately we ought to be able to come to church and not just shout and not just find grace, but also be challenged to think about how we are living out our faith in the world, to raise more questions than to give answers, to validate the logic of how someone else may have landed in a place that I don't subscribe to, but I can't demonize them because the position they've landed in is rational. Dr. Judy Finches-Williams, who's on my staff, once said to me, the problem, and we were speaking about sexual identity and orientation within church. She said the problem is that most people run to their corners and then throw rocks at the other people. So if I'm pro, I run over here. If I'm anti, I run over there. And then I demonize anyone who stands differently than I do. And I think the major challenge for us in these day and age is to embrace the validity of logic and love the person, even though I may disagree with the stance, to push us into a place of realizing that God has called us to advocate for the well-being and the justice of life in all variety, all brand, all kind. And so we push the thought and the thinking within our preaching, not just preaching how to get to heaven, but how the hell are you going to live on earth? And forgive me, I'm sorry. How are we going to live on earth? How do we embody Christ-likeness in the here and the now, and the courage to live that out, the courage to call out sin, the courage to say that all lives matter, the courage to say Black lives matter, the courage to say that LGBTQIA is welcome within our church family, the courage to say that we've got to care for the poor, the courage to say that the refugees are our brother and our sisters, and we're called to be their keepers, the courage to recognize that what is happening in Afghanistan directly affects us, the courage to admit that we are connected. And I think one of the things that really I'm passionate about that COVID has bothered me is this isolating of individual to the extent of believing I don't have communal responsibility, that I can live my life the way I want to live my life. And if it threatens your life, that's your problem. And so for me, the heart of the gospel in this day and age is a reminder, number one, that we are our brothers and sisters keeper, that we are connected, we are created in community, and I have a responsibility to live my life in a way that enhances, empowers your life and your living as well. It is also a reminder to me that we are not in control and that we are absolutely dependent upon the Lord, that all of us are in that same boat, no matter who you love, no matter what color you are, no matter how much you make. COVID has reminded us that we are all dependent upon God. And then the very third principle of the gospel that I believe is being emanated within my own life and prayerfully through our church is this question of what is truth. We live in an era.
Reverend Wesley,
Yes.
we got to listen to you, watch you on Sunday, because we've got to get to Reverend Moss.
Oh, I'm done then. I am
Reverend
done.
Moss. But I think you have really let people know that they need to tune in to Alfred Street on Sunday to hear you preach. And now, Reverend Moss, in our final minutes, we've got to hear from you because you have a global ministry, not just Chicago, but worldwide, where you actually tell people on Sundays that Trinity is unashamedly Black. Now, talk to us about what that means to you, and in the context of some of your diverse activities. And I also want you to mention that you've kept up with your documentary filmmaking because you have done a wonderful film about your grandfather's efforts to vote, which also speaks to the long tradition of civil rights activists whose Christian calling demanded their involvement in the struggle of racial equality. Reverend Moss III.
Dr. Higginbotham, thank you so very much. And just as everyone has stated, you have been an incredible blessing to me Your book, Righteous Discontents, just transformed my outlook, history, and research in reference to the African American community. Dr. Fielding Stewart's book on African American church growth, when I first started in ministry, was right there on my bookshelf. And of course, Bishop Daughtry, my family thinks that she walks on water, so I was always hearing the amazing work that she was doing. And my brother, Howard John Wesley, who has been an absolute model of ministry. And so iron sharpens iron. It's just a delight to be a part of this conversation. Trinity United Church of Christ clearly communicates that we're unashamedly Black, unapologetically Christian, because we believe that there is no disconnect between our Africanity and our Christianity. Part of the call of our church is to decolonize the Christian mind. Most people of African descent, or just human beings in general, especially who have been tainted by the American empire, our imaginations have been wrapped in the destructive cocoon of white supremacy. So when we look at the Bible, we look through white eyes and not through African eyes. I saw something on Instagram that was absolutely funny, but so very true. It was someone who made the statement and said, "What can't you find in the Bible?" And then there was a cut, and there was a white woman who looked directly in the camera and said, "You can't find white people." Now think about that. And the truth is that when you look from Genesis to Revelation, because of white supremacy, we see them as the norm, when in actuality, white people don't exist in the Bible, because that social construction did not exist. And when we're talking about people of African descent and people of color, that's the majority of who is in this particular tradition. And it was Africans who have been practicing this tradition when we move into the Aksum and the Ethiopian tradition and the early Coptic church. And so the reclamation of this theology and our imagination is part of the Trinity project. That free Black space, theological space, spiritual space that we know as the Black church is the space in which Black people were able to imagine outside of the pressure of white supremacy. And that is why, as one scholar stated, that anytime Black folk got together and they started praying, they started raising the question about revolt or about how do we get off this plantation or possibly burn it down. That's when we would sing "Swing Low, Sweet Chariot." We weren't just saying about heaven. We're talking about tonight, the chariot's coming and we're going home. We're getting on out of here. And then we might remix Roll Jordan in there in the process. So Trinity United Church of Christ has made a commitment to the community, made a commitment to decolonizing the African mind, the Black mind, and a commitment to this idea of justice, that it's not possible to only, as was already mentioned by Bishop Daughtry and also by Pastor Howard, that it's not possible for us to focus solely on personal piety. Because as one elder said it this way, if all you have is a faith tradition that focuses vertically and nothing horizontally, you don't have a cross, you have a stick. And usually sticks are used to beat people instead of transform people. And so that has been a part of our call. One of the things that we have done as a church is that we have invested close to, well, the investment will move to about $100 million, but we have invested in our neighborhood in a unique way by bringing a medical center, by housing, also creating a 27-acre community that will focus its development around three areas: economic development, empowering the Black community, environmental justice, and dismantling the mass incarceration system. And we believe that that is a form of ministry. And then how do we move ministry? By, again, decolonizing the African mind, of using the medium such as film. They're telling the story of my grandfather who had a challenge to vote. He was a powerful individual who I never met, that in 1946 made the decision to vote against Eugene Talmadge, who had made the statement, and I'm not making this up, especially for those historians out there. Eugene Talmadge said in 1946 in the Democratic primary that he wanted to make Georgia great again. And he said he wanted to make sure that no person of African descent would have the opportunity to vote. Now, he didn't use those nice terms. He used a different word speaking about us. But my grandfather, who was a single father raising 5 children, a sharecropper, refused to get remarried after his wife died because of medical apartheid, went by himself alone in rural Georgia to vote. But they kept shifting the polling place. He walked 18 miles one day, in one day, just to cast his vote, and was unable to because of the laws in place, because of segregation. And that seed placed a spark in my father, who became a part of the civil rights movement. That seed placed a spark in my aunt, who became a part of the Black feminist movement. That seed placed a spark in my other aunt, my Aunt Callie, and my Uncle Mitchell, that they would be organizers for voting in Detroit. And that seed also became a part of me, the deep commitment that you must commit your heart to God, and at the same time, commit your heart to the transformation of your immediate community. 4 things.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you so much. We are at our end, unfortunately, but this has been a wonderful, wonderful conversation. We got to do it again.